Now, image quality is a catch-all statement, and something I'm as guilty as anyone else of using, but what does it mean, and can it be improved without simply more pixels? Well, AMD and CD Projekt Red were asked both of these questions, and they've tried to answer them. The question is, did they succeed? First things first then, why have CDP or anyone moved over to using FSR2.1 when their engine, specifically Red Engine from CDP, already has a TAA based upsampler with a DRS implementation? Whilst I cannot give exact reasons for why CDP have moved over, only they know, a likely cause is the sunsetting of Red Engine, the update to The Witcher 3 Next Gen, which is probably a reason for this, and cost consolidation focus across future developments. The Xbox has its updated SDK, and likely PlayStation have also, for the PlayStation 5, now fully supports FSR2.x, although as the source is freely available and UE4 and UE5 fully supports FSR2.1 and onwards, any team can integrate it themselves. The SDK libs and samples simply help this. The reality though is for CDP, it simplifies the engine updates to use this across all formats for future updates. The reason other teams would use it is the same. Why roll your own when you can plug in an existing solution? Now, this is not to say that FSR2 or onwards is a simple plug and play, as you will still need to implement it into your engine and tweak settings on resolution scales, MIP bias, motion vectors, alpha rendering, etc. Fundamentally, all elements of your rendering that is tied to resolution. But so long as you have a TAA solution within your renderer and important things like motion vectors, temporal buffers, etc., then the work should not be too drastic. So all in all, for smaller teams, the ability to use FSR 2.1 or later as a replacement or augment to any existing TAA should have an easier job, and it will also benefit from the open source community it has. Now, PC is the same as that. You can simply add it into the menu as they have done here with DLSS, FSR, and now the DRS solution uses FSR2 instead of their own previous engine solution. Again, to streamline, reduce costs, risk, and complexity on the engine development now that they are moving over to Unreal Engine 5 for all future games. The results highlight that FSR2X is significantly better than FSR, which itself is a much simpler spatial upscaler and simpler to deploy. And they are now genuinely competing with DLSS at similar levels of performance and IQ. The benefit here in AMD's solution is it's platform agnostic and can be run on NVIDIA, AMD and Intel GPUs, unlike DLSS along with current gen consoles, which has also been added to in this latest patch, which reinforces my point of the team reducing complexity so all platforms merge into the same release pipeline. In addition, it could in theory also run on older consoles such as the Xbox One X or Pro, but based on their notes they have not implemented it into the GCN powered consoles just yet, but it might come in the future. So how good is it then compared to native rendering? Well, we can use the trusted PC for that test. Taking the game's inbuilt benchmark and running that through a 4K process close to console settings with ray trace shadows enabled, we get an average FPS of 18.4 on my RTX 2070. Turning on DLSS quality, then we see a 33% increase on that with an average of 24.4 FPS, which is very good. FSR 2.1 at the same quality levels gives us a 26% increase over native, but that is 5% less performant than DLSS on the same GPU. Still good, but nothing changes here within performance. If you have an RTX card, use DLSS, it's still the best performer for those cards. So before we dig into the console comparison, we need to dig a little deeper into the specifics. And as I often say, benchmarks are rarely indicative of real gameplay, but they are a good guide of like-for-like decreases in performance based on hardware-software changes. So in real gameplay, we see similar but not identical boosts as per the benchmark. We now bring in a raw 1440p render, as that is the base resolution for the quality levels both in DLSS and FSR 2.1 that the engine is rendering at, and then temporarily upsampling back to 4K. Which has a significant cost on frame time budget. DLSS is 28% better than native 4K and 5% faster than FSR 2.1, which itself is still 23% faster than native 4K. However, you get a clear idea on the cost of FSR and DLSS on the GPU, as at 1440p the game is almost 100% faster than 4K, 91%. and it's 48% faster than DLSS quality even. Balanced is only 30% behind it though, but comparing the 1440p to both FSR and DLSS, it's quite significantly worse. These tests demonstrate that DLSS has a cost over 1440p of approximately 32% and FSR has a 35% cost. Interestingly, these are similar figures that we've seen on other reconstruction techniques such as DICE and Gorilla's checkerboard solutions. The results give excellent payback as the image clarity and stability is significantly better than 1440p and in many cases better than native 4K. One of the big reasons is the stability of the image. Notice the popping of thin subpixel lines, the flickering of objects into and out of existence. The temporal stability is much better on DLSS than native and FSR even. It's not fully resolved, but it's certainly less impacted by this high frequency noise. FSR 2.1 is closer to native 4K in many ways. The popping is still present and other effects are almost the same, such as the bloom and the holographic sign to the right. But here you can see some of the trade-offs with DLSS. The sign is now very sharp and clean compared to 4K. It's much sharper, not the intention of the art team now, as they are intentionally using a sparse render here for that effect of a hologram. DLSS is designed to restore this back within the temporal buffers, and as such, the sign now looks more complete as it's actually filling in many of these blank pixels. It can still ghost though when too much info converges. FSR 2.1 is heavily ghosted here and can be hard to read the word at points, but this is in between the 4K target and the DLSS output. Bloom is also much weaker in DLSS with lights losing that light volume around them, as the temporal pass is likely using a higher jitter method to compensate for blended pixels that Bloom requires. Minor but noted in the comparisons here, as is the reduced texture details that DLSS uses, and that is what I mentioned earlier. See, an engine has a MIP map bias based on many things, but big ones are base rendering resolution and distance to camera. Now, mipmap or MIP is actually a play on a Latin word multum in parvo, meaning much in little. Now, these mipmaps are basically lower resolution textures materials that are used by the engine at various distances within rendering and resolution scales. When you lower the resolution the engine will use, it will pick a default lower MIP level at the same distance. This reduces load on the GPU for fill rate, bandwidth and more, and because it's a lower resolution, it makes sense. So what the team have to do is balance this out so that for 4K DLSS or FSR, they decrease the MIP levels. Confusing, I know, but the bigger the MIP number, the smaller the size. So most engines can set a bias, and you can often override this in the GPU driver, and it's likely something NVIDIA and AMD use at times to improve performance. The team would have to reduce the MIP to -1, -2 or more to compensate for the 1440p base resolution. Otherwise, you will get lower quality MIP detail, which would look worse than 4K, all things being equal. With DLSS enabled though, it may not be 100% accurate, or NVIDIA override this to claw back some performance. Either or, you can see that texture details are softer, less defined than FSR 2.1. In fact, they look columnized, which I covered in my previous Death Stranding video. Now, this is not the only reason, as by default FSR 2.1 uses a higher sharpening filter, which is a key element of all upscalers. DLSS uses one, and this helps improve the object defined detail with a balance of not over sharpening it, which can cause ringing or halos around the objects. The final difference noted here is this mipmap bias and sharpening can cause a moire pattern on thin elements and textures, which stands out more on FSR over DLSS. It does still have some issues, but it's much lower than FSR. And in fact, the reconstruction of details and textures is much faster in DLSS.
Enhanced 224 to 176.
So searching for the replicant in this one, we zoom in on PC and PS5, both running that FSR 2.1 solution, and they're a match at the quality setting with a likely 50% sharpening pass applied. You can see the neon strips break up into tiny checkerboard-like chunks as the camera bobs. This is identical on both of them, but on DLSS this is softer but bigger chunks as it blends the pixels almost instantly on the next frame. Also notice when the tiger pattern is occluded and then disoccluded, it breaks into blocky pixels for a few seconds on both PS5 and PC's FSR, but on DLSS the detail is not as affected, as are the chunky pixels around characters in the foreground, which DLSS blends better, almost like a per pixel motion blur. Remember though, this is zoomed in 400% for ease for the deckhards among you. At normal viewing distances this is much harder to notice, and comparing FSR against the previous internal engine TAAU on the Series X patch prior to this, and the Xbox One X also, you can see that pixel jitter and checkerboard like image is also present on that version, meaning FSR 2.1 is not causing it, it's simply not resolving it, whereas DLSS 2.0 is. Flicking through them, you can see that both DLSS and FSR are much better IQ than native 4K in this shot, as textures are sharper overall, with FSR being the best. Most details have a higher quality and stability of image over 4K, more so in DLSS's favour over FSR, but in this tight comparison you can just about pull these areas out that I'm showing, but when playing them at normal viewing distances they arguably look pretty much identical, but certainly look cleaner, sharper and more stable than the native 4K image on a PC, and that can only be a good thing. So focusing on the consoles now and comparing the previous 1.6 patch, which ran Red Engine 4's own TAA upsampling, we do have some significant improvements. Foliage is probably the biggest, with it being far more stable now and suffering far less from flicker. And although it still has a dithered resolve, it does define more detail, and it's possibly been improved due to subpixel samples or a higher temporal buffer range, allowing more detail to be resolved in that smaller resolution window. It has reduced flicker on thin elements and significantly increases texture and geometry resolve with FSR 2.1, and this is the biggest area of improvement now. Hair is mixed, some elements like foliage are better with alpha testing, but FSR 2 is not naturally great at this, so I do think the team have worked hard on this area specifically to improve these elements, again pointing to the fact that I think the Witcher 3 update still to come will heavily rely on this and use FSR 2.1 as well. Not everything is better though. Flickering and instability can still be high on all areas, small thin fences and things like barbed wire can be worse at times in odd occasions than the previous TAA solution. But these things are always a trade-off, and there simply is no silver bullet. In the end, the pros outweigh any cons, but bright, heavy foliage area contrast scenes benefit the most. But Cyberpunk is all about that dark night and neon streets, and in those areas the improvements can be harder to spot. PlayStation 5 and Series X, we can see they're absolutely identical in settings and image quality, with them matching up precisely to the PC's 4K FSR 2.1 quality setting at a 50% sharpness range. The Series S also uses FSR, but the lower target resolution you start from does impact IQ, and now the 1440p quality mode that it hits as a ceiling can look far noisier and softer in textures, along with worse stability than the bigger consoles. I still think overall it's better than a native 1440p, but only just. The performance mode also uses this on all three consoles now, and Series S still runs at a lower pixel count of 1920 by 1080 as a ceiling, but that FSR upsample target often comes in around 1550 and 855, and in actual fact I do see points here of 720p. meaning it is probably running right down to that performance level or even ultra performance to keep it at that 60 FPS target. This means that it ultimately has a significantly worse IQ than all of the modes, including the Xbox One X, but that is at least fixed at 30 FPS. Interestingly, the patch 1.6 tested here before this latest one, the Xbox One X targets a 2880 by 1620 high resolution within the engine's own TAA, which it tops out at, but can dip as low as approximately 2496 by 1404, meaning although it does dip below 1440p, it still looks very good and comparable to the Series X and PS5's new modes, albeit with some visual issues and gaps as covered already. Running all these side by side in normal gameplay, I think you could agree that the difference is minor at normal viewing range and certainly in action. Most will notice the increased sharpness over the previous version, certainly on foliage and textures, and maybe the team also made some tweaks to LOD, as I did note here from the previous Series X 1.6 patch, does seem to have lower LOD levels and texture details, but compared to the latest patch, the game does still have some issues with cross-platform save, so this may actually be an issue with that rather than what the team have done. Either or, the PlayStation 5 and Series X now have a visual quality level and image quality that is on par or better than the PC version running at a native 4K at the same settings. For clarity, the PC can still boost effects way above consoles now, with ray tracing being the biggest area, but not on this RTX 2070 at even 4K with DLSS Ultra performance. Overall, the performance mode on consoles also benefits from FSR 2.1, but unlike the RT mode, this seems to jump between FSR 2.1 quality, then balanced, and maybe even down to performance. In this Tin Can Alley section, I noted a low of 2240 by 1260 on both PS5 and Series X, so the team have worked here and simply replaced the entire upsampling and DRS solution as a job lot swap with FSR 2.1. And this is true on PC now, with the default DRS option also using FSR 2.1 and the auto tag, which means the game now jumps around dynamically on which setting it uses. Something which I noted and confirmed with Nixies on their Spider-Man PC port, which does the same thing with DLSS and FSR for its DRS setting when it's not using Insomniac's own solution mind. All of this leaves us with an improved visual and potentially performing title across all formats, and putting that to the test using the Series X once again with version 1.6 against 1.61 in this heavily scripted on-rail shooter, it's as close as I can get. We can see that lows can be 15% better with the latest patch of 1.16. That means it's better image quality and better performance, but on average it comes out at less than 1% difference, which means some of this may be margin of error. But what appears to be the case is, looking at the footage and the alpha effects being used here, FSR 2.1 is more performant than the older TAAU solution in the engine, and therefore they're clawing back some performance. Based on AMD's own claims on the quality setting for 4K FSR 2.1, it'll actually cost you somewhere between 1 to 3 milliseconds, which is actually quite expensive if you're at 16 milliseconds per frame at 60 FPS, and therefore this is potentially why we're seeing these dips on the older version and gaining that time back in the newer one, meaning you now get a locked 30 with a few dips down to a low point of 26 FPS. Overall though, in most sections you probably wouldn't see much of a difference, as the averages here reinforce. And all that is a great thing, as it reinforces what I've been saying since I started this channel. Pixels are not the most important element of a game's makeup, and certainly image quality. With FSR2 and DLSS2 joining all the other bigger teams' own temporally reconstructed AA solutions, I think the industry is now shifting fully into that being a baseline for all games. Yes, 4K will be a full option on PC if you have the best hardware, but the trade-off on that over other effects, AI, physics or more may become too big of a cost when you can have a better or superior image over native 4K with a 30+% increase to performance on top of that. I believe at that point the decision is made for you. To summarise the question at the start, what is image quality? Well, it's simply the sum of all the parts that make an image, and like all things, a minimum level is required. Textures, effects, and in this case that sweet spot of 1440p I often mention appears to be the case. And with the intelligent reuse of previous frames data no longer being discarded and other engine improvements to maintain a higher perceived output, we can now look forward to more titles using this technology. As it is open source and vendor agnostic, the uptake for FSR 2.1 may become a real rival for DLSS and even UE Engine 5's TAAU. The results here cement that, although far from a night and day leap based on the great base that CDP's Red engine already had, the fast and even better results shown at least reinforce that more teams can move to this technology, and then we can expect to see more and more smaller to middle teams adapting it, again allowing them to compete with the bigger studios that have rolled their own. Now wouldn't that be a sight to behold?
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
And with that, another video draws to a close. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, what can really help me is to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and leave a comment down below, which all helps that pesky algorithm to help my video get more traction on YouTube. I am completely self-funded and independent, so if you like what I do, please like, share, and all that good stuff, and also watch my content over on IGN. Anyway, I'll catch you on the next one.